All right, this is Openstax U.S. History, Chapter 4, Section 5, Wars for Empire. So in this section, we'll talk a little bit about the colonial conflicts between the great powers of Europe, namely that of England or Britain, depending on what time period we're talking about. And there are wars with both France and Spain. And one important concept to understand here is that whenever England goes to war with France or whenever Britain goes to war with Spain, those wars translate into the colonies. So there's a colonial connection. So we might say here that wars between European powers, or we'll say specifically, I think your textbook uses this term imperial. Imperial simply meaning countries that own overseas possessions. So New France, New Spain, New England, New Netherlands, like we talked about previously. Wars between European powers equal wars between colonial possessions. I don't know if there's that many S's in possessions, but whatever. In other words, a war between England and France means that there's going to be a war between New England and a war between New France. A war between England and Spain means there's a war also between New England and New Spain, and that translates in the colonial world. Very briefly, the text talks a little bit about some of the ways in which warfare was conducted in the late 1600s and really throughout the 1700s. Warfare was seasonal. That means for the most time when it was either spring or summer, that's when most of the fighting took place. And when it was winter time, due to the elements, especially in some of the areas in the northern part of North America, that was really a time for kind of rest, recuperation. The elements just really didn't allow for major combat campaigns to take place in the winter. So not really a lot of fighting taking place during the winter, most actively during the spring and the summer. The discipline in the colonial armies or in European armies at this time was very, very harsh. Officers killed soldiers for not obeying orders. Your textbook mentions where we might say that sometimes we might say soldiers were more afraid of officers than the enemy. And generally speaking, armies wore very bright uniforms. In the case of the British, they wore red. So we use this term red coat to describe a British soldier. So if we use this term red coat, that means a British soldier, a soldier fighting for Great Britain. And because of the weapon technology, guns were not super accurate. Typically, soldiers were aligned in very tight formations, in some sense, just lining up directly in front of one another on a battlefield and firing at somewhat very close quarters. So a typical military formation might involve, soldiers just being lined up shoulder to soldier. Right, shoulder to shoulder. The soldiers were lined up shoulder to shoulder, right? That's a tongue twister. Each having their guns, and they would simply just fire a volley into the enemy. And again, that was because the weapons, especially, as you start to get, later into the 1700s, into the early 1800s, this starts to change a bit. But weapons were generally unreliable, and so really the most effective way of using the guns at the time were to just simply line up in a line and shoot an entire volley into the enemy. So bright uniforms, tight formations, harsh discipline, and very seasonal in terms of the way that these wars were fought. Now, there's a handful of these wars. Warfare was very common in the 1600s and 1700s. It had a little bit different of a flavor than what war has today. War was more common. It was less deadly in a lot of cases, simply due to the technology. And attitudes and culture about warfare were just generally different. In some cases, war was seen almost like as a game or a sport, more so than it is today. But all of these conflicts, King William's War, Queen Anne's War, the War of Jenkins' Ear, and King George's War, these were all conflicts in the colonies. Each of these wars put England, right? And because we know England, we'll also add and their colonies, because anytime that England goes to war, their colonies also go to war against the various powers of Europe. So in King William's War, I believe that was versus France. In Queen Anne's War, this was versus France and Spain. This one was versus Spain, sorry, the Jenkins' Ear War. Some guy got his ear cut off by the Spanish, and England went to war over it. And King George's War, which I believe was also against France. A lot of the motivations for these wars were, part of it was cultural. So, for example, you notice that pretty much all these countries are Catholic, England being a Protestant nation. It was also political. Many of these wars had their various political reasons stemming back to the European continent. In fact, all of these wars have different names in Europe. They're part of bigger conflicts. So, for example, Queen Anne's War is also known as the War of Spanish Succession. That was a fight over who should be the next king of Spain. King George's War, I believe, is the War of Austrian Succession in Europe. So there's names for these conflicts in Europe. And in fact, a lot of the origins or even the central theme of the war is a European war. But again, whenever England or France go to war with each other in Europe for whatever reason, it could also be commercial or economic, their colonies also get tied up with it. So it's not that you really need to know these wars, the details of each one. If you understand kind of the overall theme of any time that a war breaks out between imperial powers, the colonies fight with each other, and that warfare was very common, right? It was a very common occurrence. So, some of these images here, this shows the British successfully taking a French fortification in the New World. This map here also kind of illustrates how colonial conflicts could break out. For whatever reason, this really annoys me, but in this case, the English or New England is in purple. France is in red, even though the British were the ones who wore red uniforms. And you could see that anytime that that France and England went to war, you could have potential conflicts breaking out, in the colonies, and that's in fact what happened, right? And was a very common occurrence. Now, the last of these colonial conflicts is by far the most important one. And if you remember any of these conflicts, you have to know this one, the French and Indian War, also called the 7 Years' War. All right, the 7 Years' War, same thing. 7 Years' War was what they called it in Europe. The French and Indian War is what the English colonists called this conflict. It's the same thing. And much like these other colonial conflicts, it's a much larger conflict, the 7 Years' War is. It is a war that puts Britain against their rival France. In this case, the French and Indian War is the war in North America. But Britain and France, they're also fighting in the Caribbean. They are fighting in Europe. And they're also fighting in India. All right, so this is in some cases like and you can't see that. This is in some cases a war really around the globe between the two most, at the time, probably the two most powerful imperial powers. The Spanish have sort of fell by the wayside in some ways. The Dutch have been surpassed by the British, and it's really a war to determine kind of once and for all who's going to be the premier imperial power of the later half of the 1700s. And this is the most consequential war, whereas really these conflicts, we might say about these conflicts, had no real NA for North American consequence meaning that the outcome of these wars didn't really affect the colonies all that much. This war has an enormous impact on the colonies. So this war started, the French and Indian War, or the 7 Years' War, started as a conflict between French and British land claims. Essentially, both Britain and France had made claims to land that was located around modern day Pennsylvania. They called it the Ohio Valley. We might also call it, we'll say Pennsylvania. In fact, this was where modern day Pittsburgh is located in Pennsylvania. The French built Fort Duquesne to protect their land or their land claims from the British. So Fort Duquesne, French fort to protect French land in Ohio Valley. So they were the first to act. Valley, Alley, right? George Washington, who at the time was a young land surveyor, was hired by Virginia to go out into this disputed land claim or into this disputed territory and make claims on behalf of Great Britain. He was sent with a small detachment of forces, and it was when George Washington was out in this contested land that he and his men opened fire on French forces, effectively starting the 7 Years' War, or starting the French and Indian War. We might say about George Washington, a very young at the time. We'll say a young Washington opened fire on France, starting the war. Now, initially, the war had gone very, very, very poorly for the British, right? Initially, Fort Necessity was a fort that was constructed by Washington very hastily after the beginning of the conflict. Washington subsequently surrendered this fort, right? So we might say British fort surrendered. U-R-E-D. Not sure if that's correct. British fort surrendered by Washington to France. In fact, this was the only surrender in George Washington's military career, just sort of a fun fact. In order to deal with the French threat and their Indian allies, so this ties back to something that we mentioned in the first couple chapters, and that was the fact that out of all European powers, the French had the strongest and longest lasting alliances with the Native American people. And so the reason why it's called the French and Indian War on the English side, right? So the English colonists used this term, was because the French weren't fighting alone. They were fighting with their Indian allies. Now, the English did have Indian allies of their own, but not to the degree to which the French had. So the English colonists are faced with not only fighting the French, but also a number of different Native American tribes that have allied themselves with the French. The British, who are really unable to deal with the French threat, send General Edward Braddock. So he is a British general sent to, we'll say NA for North America. British general sent to North America to deal with the French threat there. You can think of Braddock as being like the British sending in the professionals, right? They're not going to let the amateur colonists fight this war. They can't seem to win it. So let's go ahead and send the professionals like Edward Braddock, who is a well-respected and a really good general in Europe. They send him over to North America to try and handle the French, and he is killed in action. Even said that perhaps even George Washington may have carried his body off of the battlefield. Again, George Washington being a British subject fighting on the side of Great Britain in the French and Indian War. In fact, all the English colonists were fighting on the side of, they were British, right, in this particular conflict. However, though, the British did turn the war around. That was thanks to William Pitt. We'll call him a popular member of Parliament. He turned the war around. And one thing to take note of about William Pitt as a member of Parliament is that, he was somebody you could say that understood the colonists. He was, in some cases, one of the best representatives of the colonists in Great Britain. We'll just say that he was well-liked by the colonists. There were some people in Great Britain that when they came over, right? So when the war started, the British sent over officers, they sent over soldiers, they sent over bureaucrats. The British sent over quite a bit to the colonies when this war began. And, a lot of those people really didn't show the colonists the proper respect, the proper gratitude, ruled over the colonies in some ways. William Pitt was somebody who really sort of understood the colonists. This is not the only time that he pops up in American history. He pops up again once we get to some of the unraveling of the American Revolution, but he was somebody who turned the war around and, we could say at the very least was well-liked by the colonists. The British succeeded in capturing Quebec, which was the capital city of New France, and also Montreal, which was a major city as well. And the Treaty of Paris in 1763 ended the war with a British victory. Right, ended the war with a British victory. We have a map here. We can kind of see a little bit of kind of where this conflict is taking place. The purple representing the British, the yellow representing the French. And so you could see, the red representing the French, the purple representing the British, and then everything in the yellow kind of being the disputed territory where the French and British forces overlapped with one another. And so you can see it was in this area, right? Here's Fort Necessity. Actually don't know how well you can see it, but that's where George Washington was forced to surrender by the British. Right here, this was where General Braddock died, right? The professional. And the French Fort Duquesne. This is kind of ground zero for the territorial disputes that took place between Great Britain and England. Then you can see the British, they really gained the upper hand when it came to the sort of naval warfare, successfully capturing Quebec. Let's see, Quebec, I think is right in here. I think that's Quebec, or at least that's what it says. And I don't know if this actually has Montreal on it, but Montreal is somewhere in there as well. But regardless, the outcome of the war was a British victory. Now, one of the most important consequences of this was what happened to French territory, and that is all French territory, I'll say French land, went to England, Britain, in North America. Right, so New France, right, this colony that was created in the early 1600s, New France ceased to exist. All this territory would now belong to England. So England greatly expanded its territorial acquisitions. In addition to that, the British also captured French, we'll say islands in the Caribbean, forts in Africa, we'll say West Indies. West Indies is the Caribbean, and cities in India. So this war was not only a British victory in North America, where all French land went to the British side, but also meant that some islands went to Great Britain, that forts and trading posts in Africa also went to the British, and cities in India. And so the British used this term, Rule Britannia, to describe sort of an emerging global British empire, we might say at this point, after the 7 Years' War. We're talking roughly, let's see, actually we have it right here, 1754 to 1763, that after 1763, Britain was a global power. Maybe not just a global power, but was the global power. Actually, let's do that. Britain was the global power. However, though, in this conflict, and this is the important point to take note of for the purposes of our history here in the United States, was the consequence of that war. That even though the British were victorious, that they took all the French land, they took French islands, they took French trading posts in Africa, they took essentially over control of all of India, kicking the French out. That Britain was the number one global power in the world. Now, after this war, there was one glaring issue, and that was the war debt. And the big question becomes how to pay back the war debt. How to pay back the war debt. Now, this becomes an important question. It's because the answer to that question is ultimately leads us to the cause, and by the cause we mean the short-term cause, right, of the American Revolution. So any discussion about the American Revolution, the process by which 13 English colonies band together and separate themselves from the British Empire, any discussion or explanation of how that happens always begins with this conflict, the French and Indian War or the 7 Years' War.